Okay, have you got your Bibles? Will you turn with me to Romans chapter 1? I'm going to talk to you on the subject of Una Shamed. You know what Una Shamed is? I think it was was it somebody had a t-shirt and it said Una Shamed on the t-shirt? And I think it was Lynn McAnally was like, who's Una? And then whenever you put it all together, you realized it was unashamed. So I'm going to talk to you today on the subject of unashamed. Romans chapter 1. And if we pick it up from verse 16, this is Paul writing to the Romans, to the church in Rome at the time, and he says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. I'm not ashamed of this. What I preach to you, I'm not ashamed of it. It's the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. The righteousness of God is revealed. The goodness of God is revealed. Through the gospel, His goodness, His mercy, His faithfulness, His love is all revealed. I want to ask two questions today. Question number one, what exactly is the gospel? And number two, why is Paul saying here, I'm not ashamed of the gospel? The gospel, I'm sure many of you will know, basically means good news. It comes from an old Hebrew Greek word, euangelion. It just means good news. Gospel is good news. I don't know about you, but I could do with some good news in my life. I could do with some good news as opposed to what I've been getting fed for the last while. I could do with some really good news. I know for many of you it started last year when COVID hit Northern Ireland, but for me it kind of started whenever Van Dijk got assaulted by that Everton keeper. And from there it just went downhill. It was Van Dijk, it was Gomez, it was playing centre midfielders in centre half positions, and it was bad news week in, week out. How many people know what I'm talking about? Yeah. And I could do with some really good news in my life. I've got to a stage where I've had to times I just got to turn the TV off. At times I got to put the remote down because of what I listen to and what I hear that goes unchallenged on my TV screen. And I'm sitting there and honestly, I feel like just throwing the remote at the TV. And I'm like, I need some good news. And this, what Paul is talking about, he's talking about good news. I think good news is like a bit of an underestimation, because it's like the greatest news that we could ever hear, that we could ever know, that we could ever experience. It's about a man called Jesus Christ who lived on this earth 2,000 years ago. The fact that Jesus lived on this earth 2,000 years ago actually is not in question, because there is so much evidence that this man called Jesus lived on earth 2,000 years ago that you can't actually question that. You can't doubt it. There are so many writings about a man called Jesus who walked on this earth, who had disciples who followed him, who had a lot of followers, who healed people, who was crucified on a Roman cross. It is actually historically correct to say those things, that this man called Jesus walked on this earth, did what we read about in the Bible. Not just talking about the four Gospels, which we'll come to in a second, but external writings beyond those four writers that talk about this man Jesus, historians that write about this man Jesus from Nazareth, and everything that's recorded in the Bible is backed up by external biblical writings. So the fact that this man Jesus walked on this earth 2,000 years ago isn't in question. It's not in doubt. That's a historical fact. The fact that he was here isn't in doubt. The question is, who was he? Who was this man Jesus? This is a question that Jesus asked of himself as he took his disciples out on a field trip, and they went to Caesarea Philippi. And he asked the disciples, he gathers them around and says, okay boys, listen, I know there's been people talking about me. I know there's been posts up on Facebook about me, and people are saying all these things about me. What exactly are people saying? And I can imagine the disciples, and they're like, well, I'm not going to say, like, Peter, you speak up. You're always good at that there. You say something. You know, and they began to say, well, some are saying you're John the Baptist. John the Baptist was beheaded just before that, a couple of chapters before. So John the Baptist is dead, and yet people are saying, well, he's John the Baptist. Some people even, it gets worse because you're going back hundreds of years. Well, some people are saying you're Jeremiah or Elijah, one of the prophets from the Old Testament, guys that hundreds and hundreds of years ago they lived. This is what people are saying about Jesus. This is what people are talking about, what they're posting up. And then Jesus makes it a bit more personal. He says, okay, forget about that, about what other people are saying. Who do you say I am? Because this is what's most important. Forget about what your friends think. Forget about what your family thinks. Forget about what people are saying on Facebook and on Instagram about me. What do you say about me? Who am I to you? And at that moment, Peter steps up and Peter says, you're the Christ, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus responds, it's correct, Peter. Well done. Because it's not flesh and blood that has revealed this to you. It's not through anything like that there, but my Father in heaven has revealed this to you. Some people say that Jesus never actually said he was the Messiah. He did on so many occasions. That's the reason why they put him to death, was because he claimed to be the Messiah. That's why the Pharisees tore their clothes and had him nailed to a cross. And in Peter answering that question, Jesus doesn't debate it. Jesus doesn't say, no, Peter. Jesus actually says, yes, I am. I am. God has revealed this to you, Peter. Yahweh has revealed this to you, Peter. That's who Jesus was. He was the Messiah. And so, this is the good news, that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, came to earth for us. And it's recorded. We have in our Bibles 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But as I said earlier on, there are other writings. In fact, if we take a look at Luke, and if we look at Luke chapter 1, and Luke says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. So he says many. It's not just that it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John who have written about Jesus. Luke is saying that many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. Verse 2, just as they were handed down to us by those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So Luke is saying, first of all, that there's been a load of people that have written about Jesus. Second of all, a lot of them, most of them, have been eyewitnesses to what took place in the life of Jesus. And then Luke goes on and he says, with this in mind, bearing this in mind, with this in my heart and my mind, that all of these people have written about Jesus, that eyewitnesses have written testimonies about Jesus. With this in mind, I myself have carefully investigated everything. Luke was a physician. He was a doctor. So Luke was very much into detail. He had to be. And what Luke is saying, he's saying that other people have written about Jesus. Eyewitnesses have written accounts of his life. And so I've taken these things, I've borne these in mind. And so I have investigated what has been written. I have talked to the eyewitnesses. I've talked to the people that they're talking about. So whenever you read about people being healed, Luke is writing his about 20 to 30 years after the life of Jesus Christ. And so some of the eyewitnesses would still be alive, and he's able to interview them. The people who have been healed, he's able to go and actually see them. And the town would know, yeah, that's the one that was lame, that's the one that was blind, that was the one that was dead. They're alive, they can see, they can walk. And Luke carefully investigates everything from the beginning. So I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. This is who he's writing to. So that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. So Luke is saying, this is why I'm writing this. Theophilus, this is for you. I've investigated everything. I've talked to the eyewitnesses. There's a detailed explanation of what has went on here so that you will believe that Jesus Christ was the Messiah. Matthew writes his gospel. Matthew was a tax collector, called by Jesus, a disciple of Jesus, written between AD 60, AD 70. So again, roughly 30 years, 25, 30, 35 years after all of the Gospels were written years after Jesus has died and has risen from the dead and has ascended into heaven, between 20, 30, 40 years after. So there's still an opportunity for people to challenge what is being written. And so Luke is writing to Theophilus so that he will believe, and everybody that reads his gospel will believe. Matthew is writing for the Jewish people, because what Matthew does, whenever you're reading through Matthew, you will see that Matthew very often refers to Old Testament prophecies, where the Messiah would be born, how he would be born, where he would live, where he would come from. There's so many references because Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience, trying to convince them that Jesus Christ was their Messiah. And so Matthew writes his gospel. Mark writes his. Again, around they reckon that Mark was probably the first gospel written. And he's writing to the church in Rome the same way that Paul has been writing to Romans here. And the church in Rome is under persecution, under severe persecution. And so Mark says, you know what? I'm going to write an account of the life of Jesus Christ to prove to them, to help them to remember why it is that they believe in Jesus, why it is that they follow Jesus. I'm trying to get them to remember, because they're under severe persecution. They're being put to death. They're being brought into theaters where they're being mauled by lions and tigers and being put to death in front of thousands of other people. And this is what the church had to face in the days of the early church, in those years after Jesus Christ has left. And Christians are questioning, are we doing the right thing here? And so Mark is saying, yes, look at his life. Look at everything that has happened. Look at everything that has taken place. Hold firm, church. Hold strong, church. And then you got John. John's just on another planet of his own. And John writes his gospel. And in John chapter 20 and verse 30, John writes these words. He says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And so we got these 4 gospels in the Bible. We got many other writings outside of the Bible, historians, other people that have written an account of this man, Jesus Christ. Who do you say that he is? And this is the good news, church. Is that what is recorded in those gospels is of a baby that is born in Bethlehem. He's the Messiah. He's God, Emmanuel, come down to earth. Matt, if you can sort this out, please. And he comes to save us, to redeem us, to buy us back, to set us free. He steps out of heaven. This is the good news, is that he left the glory of heaven to come down to this earth. So let me just share very quickly, and then we're going to come to a close. Give me 10 minutes. Let me just share a few things about the gospel. Number one is that the gospel was planned. Because in Jesus stepping out of heaven, he was fulfilling the plan of the Father, the plan of heaven. In Revelation chapter 13, Jesus is described as the Lamb slain from before the creation or the foundation of the world. What happened on the cross was planned in heaven. What happened on the cross was God's plan. In fact, God even gave the first prophecy in Genesis chapter 3 back in the Garden of Eden, as he said that, talked about the seed of the woman who would crush the head of Satan. So everything was planned. Second of all is that the gospel is based around an eventful weekend. An event that takes place over the course of a weekend, which kind of begins today. Because with today being Palm Sunday, that is the day whenever Jesus rode into Jerusalem, fulfilling a prophecy in Zechariah. And everybody begins to lay down palm leaves and their cloaks before Jesus and begin to worship Jesus as he rides into Jerusalem. The Pharisees begin to shout at Jesus saying, tell your disciples to be quiet, because they understood the significance of what was going on. of the prophecy that Jesus Christ was fulfilling. Tell him to shut up. Tell him to be quiet. It was Palm Sunday. That week rolls by, Jesus teaching in the temple and the Pharisees plotting to arrest him and to have him killed. And it all comes together. The plan of heaven all comes together over the course of a weekend that we know as Good Friday and as Easter Sunday. The good news of Jesus Christ. It was planned. It's over one eventful weekend. It's about covenant. We're going to speak a little bit more about this on Friday night. Because whenever Jesus gathers his disciples together for the Last Supper, we're told that he lifts the cup and he says, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." As we celebrate his death and resurrection on Friday through communion, we will unpack this a little bit about God's covenant with us. Now, number 4, the gospel has a purpose. And the purpose of the gospel is to bring forgiveness, to bring freedom, to redeem us, to transform us. We were singing earlier on there about freedom. And I was kind of thinking, you know what, it's very possible to be saved and not be walking in freedom. It's very possible to be saved and not free. The children of Israel were set free from slavery from Egypt, but still in some ways weren't free. They still, even though they were out of Egypt, weren't yet free from Egypt, from the influences that Egypt had on them. And it's very possible to be saved and not be free. I want to tell you today, you are called to walk in freedom. Who the Son sets free is free indeed. You are free, so walk in that freedom. Sometimes I think we feel unworthy. We feel worthy enough to kind of get out of Egypt, but we don't feel worthy enough to walk in complete freedom. Out of shame and guilt and fear and whatever it is, it still has a hold of us. Holds us back from the freedom that God has called us into. And this is the purpose of the gospel, to set us free from that life of sin, so that it no longer has a hold on us. The gospel has purpose. Forgiveness, redemption, the gospel it's a redemptive message. It's a transformative message. So the people, whenever they look at us as ones who are saved, should be saying, I don't know that person anymore. I don't know that person. And they have totally changed. This is what the gospel does. In 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 18, Peter writes this. He says, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous." That's him for us. We're the unrighteous. The purpose to bring you to God. It's the gospel. That's the good news. It's the amazing news, is that there is no other way to God but through Jesus Christ. And as he suffered and as he dies on that cross, the purpose is to provide a way to bring us to the Father, to bring us to God. I don't know about you, but it stirs my heart. So why did Paul say, I'm not ashamed? Why would he feel the need to say, I'm not ashamed? Because of how good this news is. Because of how amazing and how great this news is. Why does Paul feel the need to say, I'm not ashamed of this news? I'm not ashamed of this message. Why does he feel the need to write those words? I think that the gospel addresses the issue of the human heart. See, the human heart, it's Jeremiah that tells us, is deceitful. And I think that there's this conflict between the world and the gospel. I think there's this conflict. And sometimes we in our lives, we just want to pursue our own things outside of Christ, outside of God. Anybody been there where you just been pursuing your own thing? Just me, that's okay. And if you know what it's like to just pursue your own thing outside of God, then you will know what kind of a road that leads you down. And I would say that for those that have journeyed that road, that it hasn't been healthy, hasn't been helpful, hasn't made you whole, hasn't brought you peace. If anything, it has taken you into some very dark places and has caused destruction and mayhem in your life, and perhaps, I'm sure, the lives of others. Solomon, when he's writing Ecclesiastes, Solomon had everything, wanted for nothing. And he talks about pursuits in life. And he says it's meaningless. It's meaningless. Everything is meaningless. And he goes through chapter after chapter talking about all the pursuits that people can have in life, accumulating so much wealth, fame and fortune. But he says it's meaningless, it's pointless. And right at the very end of all the chapters of Ecclesiastes, he writes these words. He says, this is the crux of the matter. This is what it all comes down to. Fear God and obey his commands. It's the purpose of life. Fear God and obey his commands. But we find it so difficult to do that. Even going way back to the Garden of Eden, where God says, puts Adam and Eve in the garden and says, listen, you can eat of anything you want, but see that one tree, don't touch it. But in our own pursuits, we want to touch that tree. We want to eat of that tree that God warned us was going to bring death and destruction. And yet we want to pursue that over God. I believe that only a life lived in relationship with God brings true satisfaction. And the gospel message is that we can have that relationship. But I think what Paul is saying as I come to a close, the reason why he says, I'm not ashamed of this message, is that Paul was seeing a world, and I believe we're living in this world today, where there has been such an increase of societal and cultural changes that are ungodly and that are in complete contrast to the gospel, to the message of the gospel, to the message of Jesus Christ. And I think that Paul saw similarities in his day to what maybe I see today. If we read through chapter 1 of Romans, and he starts, if we can go back to verse 14, and Paul says, I'm obligated, this is as I come to a close, I'm obligated to preach both to the wise, to the foolish, Greeks, non-Greeks. That's why I'm so eager to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome. Then he says, I'm not ashamed of this gospel, because it's the power that brings salvation. And then he goes on in verse 18 and he says this: the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. See if you can see any similarities with what Paul is writing to the church in Rome here to what is going on today, because I can see similarities. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood what has been made, so that people are without excuse. So what Paul is saying here is, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And then he goes on, I think, to give a bit of a reason why. Because in the world today, there are people that are living their lives and they are turning their backs on God to do their own thing and to live their own lives. But they're without excuse, because it's so obvious that God is real. And God has revealed himself to these people, but they have turned their backs on him. But I'm not going to be ashamed of the gospel, because they're living in opposition to this message. He goes on in verse 21 and he says, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile. Their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images to look like mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. They made false gods and they worshipped these false gods. Therefore, God gave them over to their sinful desires to the sinful desires of their hearts, to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie. They worshipped and they served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women who were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They're gossips, they're slanderers, God haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree, those who do such things deserve death. They not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. The Message version says this right at the very end. They didn't bother to acknowledge God. So God quit bothering them and let them run loose. And all hell broke loose. They made life hell on earth with their envy, bickering, cheating, mean-spirited, venomous, fork-tongued God-bashers, bullies, swaggerers, insufferable windbags. They keep inventing new ways of wrecking lives. They ditch their parents, and they get in the way, stupid, slimy, cruel, cold-blooded, and it's not as if they didn't know better. They know perfectly well what they're doing. They know perfectly well they're spitting in God's face. They don't care. Worse than that, they hand out prizes for those who do the worst things best. So Paul is setting up a scene here, I think. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It lives in contradiction, the world lives in contradiction to the gospel. So Paul is saying, I'm not going to be ashamed of the gospel. In spite of what culture may say, and how culture may want to force me down a specific road, I'm not going down that road. I'm going to live counter to what the world says, to what society says, and to what the culture would dictate to me. I'm not ashamed of this message. This message transforms lives. This message takes those people who are willing and redeems them, because we were all in this boat. We were all a part of this crowd. But Paul says at the start, it's for those that believe. So at some point, a majority of us in this room said, I believe, and it transformed us and it changed us. And we can testify to that in this place today. And so that's why I can stand here and I can echo the words of Paul. I'm not ashamed of this gospel, because this is the good news that changes lives, that transforms lives, and that saves lives. I believe that we're coming into a time where it's going to become increasingly more difficult to live out those biblical principles. When I see decisions that are being made and changes in culture and society, that it becomes so much more difficult to hold a biblical opinion. So I want you to hold fast to these words. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Why? Because it's the power of God that brings salvation. It's the power of God that redeems, that restores, and that sets us free. Father God, we want to thank you